2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews."
Good morning. Today is the first Sunday of Lent, and we have a real challenge. We have 2,000 years of church history, and as a result, we have become so familiar with the cross that we think that we've mastered it. We've read about it. We've seen movies about it. We've heard sermons. We're at the point where we don't really look at the cross in wonder. We look at it and we think, I'm grateful for the cross. But I don't know that there's a whole lot more I can learn about it. Combine that with the fact that life is complex and challenging in so many ways. And so the thought of getting something new from a 2,000-year-old event that we believe we've mastered and trying to get fresh meaning, it's quite a challenge. Yet that's the challenge that we face. And it's vital that we embrace it because the cross is vital to those who follow Jesus. Jesus himself in Luke 9 said this, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." So if you want to follow Jesus, 2 things are required of you. First, and these things, by the way, are inextricably linked. The first is you deny yourself. And the second is to carry your cross. Now, we hear carry your cross, and it means something very different to us than it did to the people that Jesus originally said it to. So in order for us to pick up our cross as Jesus wanted, we must understand the cross as Jesus did. And to do that, we have to be willing to re-examine it. And that's the challenge before us, not only find fresh meaning in the cross, but to let it inform the way that we live. Now, you can learn a lot about someone from their final words. They seem to mark a person's legacy. It's often how they're remembered. It's a window many times into what's really important to them. The example that's closest to my heart, that means the most to me, is that of my grandmother. So my grandmother was about, 5'2", little Mexican woman. And all 5'2" of her was filled with the love of Jesus. She was a terrifying woman. Don't mess with her. But she had a tenderness that I can't really convey. And the primary thing that I always felt from her was love. She died when I was in high school. Some kind of liver disease. I honestly can't tell you because I never wanted to know. I was just so upset. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to think about it. I kind of wanted to pretend that it wasn't happening. She knew she was dying. And so because of that, she got to plan her own funeral. And so these aren't exactly her last words, but certainly her last message to those that knew her and loved her. So if you could, just picture we're in a Catholic church. It's, it's pretty ornate, very different from our church. You got a center aisle, and myself, except, like 13, 14-year-old version of me, pallbearer. I'm walking the casket down with my cousins, uncles, family. We're all crying because we just lost this wonderful woman. And a man on the stage says in just a very somber voice, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord." And then the mariachi starts going, and it is upbeat, it is live, it is a party. And we're just walking this casket down the aisle. We're laughing, we're crying. I mean, I will never forget this moment. It just said so much about my grandma and what was important to her. The faith that she had, that she knew in this moment, I'm celebrating, I'm dancing, I'm the best version of myself, and I want you to join the party. And it touched me. We think about final words. There's a lot of historical examples, right? Bob Marley, he's got a biopic coming out, right? His final words: "Money can't buy life." Harriet Tubman, she's dying in 1913. She's gathered her family around, and her last words were, "Swing low, sweet chariot." Caesar Augustus, he said, "I found Rome in clay. I left it to you in marble." Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, apparently his famous last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Have you ever thought about your own last words? Like, what will I say? What will it be? What will it say about me? Well, the incredible thing about the scriptures is that we have the last words of Jesus. We don't have to speculate as to what was important to him. We've got 7 sayings from the cross, and these things give us incredible insight into how we can carry our own cross as we follow Jesus. As he carried his cross, Jesus, we see forgiveness, salvation, relationships, suffering, reunion, and triumph. We don't have to wonder what's important to Jesus. He tells us in his final words on the cross. And so even though we think we might know everything about the cross, and even though this is going to be another series where you're hearing about the cross and about what Jesus has done, the cross tells us so much about who God is, about his nature, about his character, what's important to him. And it also reveals a lot about ourselves. So as we spend the next several weeks looking at the cross, I want to take a moment just to put it into context for you. The passage that we just heard, you've got 2 criminals crucified next to Jesus, one on each side. He's been betrayed in the garden. His disciples have left him. They're gone. They ran away. So Jesus' closest friends, the people that he's poured his life into for years, they've abandoned him. He's brought to a corrupt trial where charges and false witnesses have stood against him. They've accused him and lied about him. He's been flogged and mocked by Roman authorities. He's been insulted and slandered by the crowds around him, rejected by his own, betrayed, abandoned, sentenced, and now they want to execute him. Then these three words, some of the most important, powerful words in the scriptures, it just says, they crucified him. Of all the ways that Jesus could have died, he chose the cross. The trauma of the cross is such that a person is beaten and whipped, deprived of sleep. And then while they're on the cross, the person has to pull themselves up in order to breathe. The wounds on their back from the whipping, scraping against the bar that they're crucified to, causing horrific pain. The nails in the wrist would crush or sever the long sensory median nerves, causing relentless bolts of pain every time he breathed. The nails in the feet would likely pierce the deep perennial plantar nerves, causing the same results. In fact, the most extreme word in the English language to describe pain is the word excruciating, which comes from the Latin excruciatus, or out of the cross. This is what Jesus is going through at this moment. He's abandoned, he's betrayed, and now he's been crucified on a hill just outside the city that he said he was going to reside amongst the people in. So I want you to see two main things here. The first is Christ's persecution, just what he endured. But the second is his prayer, how he chose to respond. Now, you've got multiple groups of people in this scene. The first is the crowd. People, they just stood there watching. Now, who are these people that are just enjoying the crucifixion of Jesus? Who are they? They're just people. Just normal, common people. The same people who a few days earlier had yelled Hosanna at the triumphant entry. Jesus, he's walked in and they're thinking, at last, finally, someone who's gonna come and save us from the Roman Empire. Someone who's gonna come and make everything's right. God's chosen Messiah here at last. But the crowd is fickle. A week ago, he walked in triumph, but now he's being crucified in shame. Many of them, they've heard Jesus teach. He's likely healed some of them, or they've experienced his miracles. Yet the religious leaders turned them against Jesus. They're disappointed that he didn't deliver. And now they heap abuse on him. The crowds are always fickle. You have the Jewish rulers, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the chief priests, and they've come together and they said, Jesus, you will not rule us. And what's crazy is you've got this resistance from the Roman governor. It's the Jewish leaders who are pushing for this crucifixion. Look at what it says in John 19. So Pilate, he's trying to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders, they just kept shouting, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. They hate Caesar, by the way. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and he sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away. Take him away. Crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate said. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. And so finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So this is an extraordinary situation here. The Jewish rulers have conspired against Jesus, and the Roman leaders, they just see him as like a problem to be solved. You know, he maybe a political threat, but a disturbance, an annoyance more than anything. Now, in Jewish theology, particularly if you look in the book of Deuteronomy and in chapter 21, it says that anyone hanging from a tree was cursed by God. So how can this person claim to be the Messiah, yet he's going to experience the curse of God? Jesus was being cursed by God. They just couldn't comprehend that he wasn't being cursed for his sins. He was being cursed for theirs. And then you have the soldiers. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. One commentator says that they basically tried to make it like a parade, a huge spectacle, all just to mock the king of the Jews, this failed king, Jesus. So you have Jesus, the Son of God. His friends have abandoned him. Everyone has turned on him. And then these soldiers who are crucifying him naked on a cross. What a moment in history. The God of all creation on a cross, crucified by his creation. They've rejected him. C.S. Lewis says this, that basically he says that he did this in love. He says, herein is love. This is the diagram of love himself, the inventor of all loves. So Jesus, he endures all of this. And what is his response in love? He prays, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, commentators tell us that this word, it's in a Greek tense, which literally means that Jesus said this repeatedly. So it wasn't just like at one pointed moment, he said, Father, forgive them. And then he suffered on the cross and died. No, he repeated this as they're crucifying him. As they're slandering him, Father, forgive them. As they're nailing him to a cross, Father, forgive them. As he's being whipped and beaten, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. As they're putting him to death, he's praying for them. He's asking for God's mercy and forgiveness to be poured out on them. Notice two things about this prayer. First, he's praying to the Father. And why does this matter? I think it matters because he's accessing the Father's heart. Like, who was this Father? In John's gospel, we're told that this is the Father who loved the world so much that he gave his Son. This is the same Father that when the prodigal comes home, he doesn't just stand there and wait for him. No, he runs out to meet him. So he's appealing to the loving God, the Father, who's giving his Son on behalf of sinners. He's aligning his heart with the Father's heart. Jesus is on the cross to save these people. And his prayer is simple. Forgive them. You know, a lot of criminals on death row, they'll confess their crimes. They'll actually speak, not directly, but talk about their remorse for what they've done, ask forgiveness from their victims or the families of their victims. But Jesus doesn't confess his crimes. He has none. Instead, he confesses the crimes of those killing him, and he asks God to forgive them. Why? Because they do not know what they are doing. Jesus, he had a way of saying this throughout his ministry. He told the woman at the well in John chapter 4, he said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. See, Jesus understood what we did not understand, what humanity could not comprehend. People just couldn't wrap their head around who he was and what he was offering. Now, they did have some idea of what they were doing. The Roman soldiers were very well trained in crucifixion. In fact, they were penalized if they didn't do it properly. Yet Peter, in Acts chapter 3, he says, now brothers, I know you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says, none of the rulers of this age, if they had understood it, would have crucified the Lord of glory. And then he even says about his own testimony, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. So they didn't really comprehend that they were crucifying the Son of God. They were caught up in the tyrannical forces of the day and got caught up in it, and they're complicit, right? They're party to it. And this truly speaks to the wonder and the forgiveness of the cross. This is powerful. If a religious leader can be forgiven for betraying the Messiah, you can be forgiven. If a soldier crucifying Jesus, actually nailing him to a cross, can be forgiven, then you can be forgiven. If his disciples who ran away at Jesus' greatest moment of need, if they can be forgiven and restored, you can be forgiven and restored. If a fickle crowd turns their back on him, but can be converted and forgiven, then you can as well. Jesus is saying from the cross, there is nothing you have done that God will not forgive. So what we're called to do with our sin is run to the cross. Is bring it to the cross. It's God's kindness that leads to repentance. You can bring your guilt. You can bring your shame, and he will not condemn you. He has grace, mercy, and forgiveness for you. And then as you go through the book of Acts, you begin to see the impact of this sacrifice, the forgiveness of sins extended to everyone. On the day of Pentecost, 3,000 Jews were converted. Many were the same ones who yelled, "Crucify him." Then we begin to see priests and religious leaders embrace Jesus, even though they formerly wanted him crucified. That is the wonder of forgiveness. And this is where the cross stands out. When I was in college, just a couple years ago, I took a class on the world's religions. And basically you'd learn about these various religions and kind of compare them. So Hinduism has karma. But it's not like you're in the line at Starbucks and someone paid for your drink, are you gonna pay it forward kind of karma? Like a little more serious than that. This is where you get paid back for what you've done. Buddhism doesn't know anything of a personal, forgiving God. Islam has the concept of a personal God, but he's not a father who runs down the road to greet the prodigal. He's a father who makes you get your act together. And then when you have finally made restoration, maybe you get that personal relationship. Nothing speaks of the cross of Jesus like the cross of Jesus. It's extended to the least likely people who've done nothing to earn it. Marshall Hoffman says this. He says, the door of the kingdom of God swings open on the hinges of forgiveness. I mean, it's really true. God's kingdom is now available to all who ask through forgiveness. So Christ's plea is that his followers would then embody this same kind of enemy love. All right, audience participation time. You guys ready? Oh boy. All right, my son's ready. Thank you. What is the most famous verse in the Bible? I heard a lot of John 3:16. That's what we're going to go with. That's the one I would say is the most famous. For God so loved the world, right? And we've actually kind of been talking through that. That's why Jesus was on that cross. Do you know what the John 3:16 of the early church was? The first 300 years of church history. I mean, they had it on bumper stickers and bracelets. Their gladiators wrote it on the eye black. It was on t-shirts. It was a big deal. It was Matthew 5:44. Jesus, he's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This was the rally cry of the early church. And in this moment is where those two verses intersect. God's love for the world, giving his son, and at the same time, loving and forgiving his enemies. The early church took this seriously. They were literally put into places of persecution and torment, and they would forgive the people as they were doing it to them. In fact, the way Christians died was so impressive. At times, unbelievers left the stands and joined Christians because the way that they were put to death, they were so compelled by the love that these Christians showed. And so here's Jesus being tested against his own teaching. Was this just a theory? Is it something that looks good on your wall? Is it just theology? Or does he really mean it? And now, as his actual enemies are killing him, he prays for them. He asks the Father to forgive them. 1 Peter 2:23 says this, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. You see, Jesus not only teaches us to love those who persecute us, he lives it out. This is the Son of God praying for those crucifying him. The church, at its best, is taking Jesus' spirit and living it out in the world today. It's following in the footsteps of our Savior It's picking up our cross and forgiving the very people who put us on it. When we're wronged, we take Jesus' message, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. And we extend it to the world around us. When you look at the fracturing of our society today, what's going to get us over our differences and our hatred, our division? Is it social media? TikTok? Anyone? Is it politics? Who do we look to? What's the concept that can heal the bleeding wounds of our society? I believe that it's picking up our cross through costly forgiveness. Forgiveness is costly. If you've been wronged, you have to bear that cost. If someone steals from you, you have to replace what was stolen. You can forgive them, but it's going to cost you to replace it. And the same principle, it works its way up all the way to God himself. At great cost was God able to forgive us. Now, this is the part of the message where people like to, dismiss things. It's like, well, that's sentimental preacher talk. That doesn't work in the real world. Well, a few years back, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine. It's an incredible story. It's called Portraits of Reconciliation. Basically, they came back after the Rwandan genocide. So the Rwandan genocide happened about 30 years ago, and the Hutus sought to wipe out the entire Tutsi minority when the government was Hutu controlled. They launched a military campaign and killed between 800,000 to 1 million people. As you can imagine, you have a nation living in trauma. And everyone is trying to figure out, they're asking the question, how do we move forward? How do we heal the wounds? And so they sent a photographer to southern Rwanda 2 decades after, and they captured a series of unlikely, almost unthinkable photos. The first, here you have a woman resting her hand on the shoulders of a man who killed her father and brothers. The next is a woman posing with a man casually reclining who looted her property and whose father murdered her husband and her children. The people who agreed to be photographed are part of a continuing national effort towards reconciliation. They work closely with AMI, which is Association Modeste et Innocent. It's a nonprofit organization. In AMI's programs, small groups of Hutus and Tutsis are counseled over many months, culminating in the perpetrator's formal request for forgiveness. If forgiveness is granted, the perpetrator and his family and friends typically bring a basket of offerings. It's usually food or banana beer. And then they seal this forgiveness with a song and a dance. Here are some real accounts. So this man said, because of the genocide in 1994, I participated in the killing of the son of this woman. We are now members of the same group of unity and reconciliation. We share in everything. If she needs water to drink, I fetch some for her. There's no suspicion between us, whether under the sunlight or during the night. I used to have nightmares recalling the sad events I've been through, but now I sleep peacefully. And when we are together, we are like brother and sister, no suspicion between us. The victim says, "He killed my child." Then he came to ask me pardon. I immediately granted it to him because he did not do it by himself. He was haunted by the devil. I was pleased by the way he testified to the crime instead of keeping it in hiding, because it hurts if someone keeps hiding a crime they committed against you. Before, when I had not yet granted him pardon, he would not come close to me. I treated him like an enemy, but now I would rather treat him like my own child. Another story, I burned her house. I attacked her in order to kill her and her children, but God protected them and they escaped. When I was released from jail, if I saw her, I would run and hide. Then AMI started to provide us with trainings, and I decided to ask her for forgiveness. To have good relationships with the person to whom you did evil deeds, we thank God. She says, I used to hate him. When he came to my house and knelt down before me and asked for forgiveness, I was moved by his sincerity. Now, if I cry for help, he comes to rescue me. When I face any issue, I call him. We forget that radical forgiveness, in spite of legitimate evil, transforms the world. Followers of Jesus, when we seriously consider, or we take it seriously to have enemy love and forgiveness for others, we transform our world. And ultimately, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing, resulted in the Roman Empire itself saying, Father, forgive us, for we know what we've done. 300 years later, the Roman Empire converted to Christianity because of the power of enemy love. John Stott says, before we can begin to see the cross as something done for us, we have to see it as something done by us. We have to acknowledge our own guilt, our own sin, how we are complicit. You are a part of the problem. You're somewhere in that crowd at the crucifixion. Either you're frustrated and cheering his crucifixion because he didn't do what you would like him to. You're a religious person who wants to maintain control. A godless person who only cares about power and control. Or a failed disciple who's abandoned the Lord. All of us are complicit in the death of the Son of God. But acknowledging this changes everything, because we see that Jesus is offering us enemy love. And this is the wonder of our forgiving God on the cross. These final words of Jesus, they speak through the ages. They speak to us today, 2,000 years later. And so the question is, do you need to receive his forgiveness? Do you need Jesus to speak this over you? Do you need to say, Father, forgive me? I don't know what I've done. Or maybe you need to embrace the way of Jesus and extend forgiveness to someone who's wronged you. When we receive forgiveness, it allows us to extend forgiveness. It's part of carrying our cross, extending costly forgiveness. Someone's done something to you, something terrible, something evil. And you've done the most natural thing with it. You have retribution in your heart. There's a spirit of revenge rather than a spirit of reconciliation. And I know this is complex. I realize this stuff takes time. But the cross was complex. And Jesus' offer still stands. He invites us to receive forgiveness and reconciliation so that we can extend forgiveness and reconciliation. You cannot give what you do not have. But as we follow Jesus, we receive his grace, we receive his forgiveness, and we extend it to those around us. We see his example as he carried his cross, and we follow him as we carry our own. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we come to you truly in awe of what you have done for us on the cross. Though we didn't physically put you on that cross, we know that our actions did. That while we were your enemies, that while we were far from you, while we weren't even thinking of you, you died for us to give us reconciliation, to reunite us with our Father, to show us his heart. And so, God, I pray that we would just start by receiving your forgiveness. This can be so hard, God. But would the power of your forgiveness penetrate deep into who we are? That we would not question, that we would never doubt. No matter what we've done, you have forgiven us. And that we would then reflect that. Reflect your forgiveness to those around us. For the small ways that we've been persecuted, to the massive, horrible ways that we've been hurt. Would you help us by the power of your Spirit to forgive? We ask this in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.